call unto thee, O Lord, and send thou my light to guide us, for we are weak and afraid, and we lack knowledge. There is no one to hear your plea, no one to answer you, no one to ease your suffering. Lord, have mercy upon us.
Hey, welcome to the NY Patriot Show. Here we delve deep into the abyss, covering topics such as occultism, spirituality, secret societies, conspiracies, and the unknown. Join us in trying to put these pieces together and figuring all this shit out. The NY Patriot Show. Hey everyone, welcome back to the NY Patriot Show. Thank you for all for stopping by and checking out another show. Today, by popular demand from other listeners that I have, and I don't know if it was in Discord or Element. Actually, I mean, could have been from a few areas, but I have had a bunch of people within like the same week or two ask me to have George from CAVDEF.org on. So today, here we have George from CAVDEF.org. George, why don't you let everybody know, I guess, what your deal is, what is it that you do, and the topic that you wanted to bring to the show today. And thank you for coming on as well.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I've basically been in the sort of parapolitical research and investigation field for the past 6 years at this point. I started out interested in election fraud, which is actually the namesake of CAVDEF, Coalition Against Voter Disenfranchisement and Election Fraud, and quickly started to realize as I tried to drill into the issue of who is behind U.S. elections, who controls the machines, who's behind these companies, networks of corrupt election officials, that there was a massive sort of network of organized crime intersecting with circles of political power. And so my area of inquiry into elections quickly led me into all sorts of other realms like political assassinations, drug running, and ultimately human trafficking scandals like the Franklin case. And so I basically became aware of all of these evil, horrible things that were going on, protected by the very apex of power, and I sort of became determined to do what I could to gather evidence and try to convince as many people as possible that this is what was going on in the world, and hope to expose it and see justice be done for all of these cases after so many years. And that's basically been a big focus of mine. Do a lot into pedophile ring cases, including the abduction of Johnny Gosch and how it ties into the Franklin scandal, which I hope to get to cover very thoroughly today. Yeah,
no, for sure. I find that very interesting because, like I said to you prior, I know with the Occult Rejects, we did kind of, we did actually cover the Franklin scandal too. So, I mean, let me finish what I was going to say. And we have covered Gacy. And, then you mentioned Johnny Gosch. And there's just so much, I feel like, going on with in that time, during that area, during that age. I mean, but the one thing I wanted to say, and I think it's great that with looking at some of these past things, is because with the Franklin scandal, if you were to go back and look at that, well, for one, and, I don't pick either side. But, nowadays it always seems like this stuff only comes from the left. If you go back to the Franklin scandal, for one, you'll see there was a bunch of Republicans involved, in my opinion, too. But these things that happened then, like to me, that's just as bad, if it might have been worse than maybe what even Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell was doing.
Yeah, or at the very least, I mean, what was what we know publicly about Epstein? I mean, I believe that there's also a lot of hidden underbelly to Epstein's case. A lot of trafficking of children, even younger than teen years, which the public perception is that with most of Epstein's victims. And I believe that it was even worse than that. But certainly, the Franklin, the allegations that we know publicly are, at a level that doesn't even match, what we saw in the Epstein case. I mean, ritual murders, snuff films being made. There's so much incredible darkness in the Franklin scandal, and yet, as far-fetched as it seems to people, it can be extensively, corroborated, as Nick Bryant in his book, The Franklin Scandal.
That's an amazing book.
Before that, yeah, that's pretty well documented by a relatively, mainstream type journalist who also broke a lot of Epstein stories, and yet it gets roundly ignored all throughout the mainstream press.
Who was that other guy that put out a book too on the Franklin scandal?
Yeah, that was John DeCamp, who was he was a Nebraska state senator. He also was sort of an advisor to the members of the Nebraska legislature who were investigating the Franklin scandal, and he later was also the lawyer for Paul Bonacci, one of the victims, who later came forward and indicated that he was part of the Johnny Gosch abduction. So yeah, DeCamp was involved in this stuff from the beginning. There are certain questionable things about him, like his association with CIA Director William Colby, who was sort of his mentor. That there are signs that he may not have represented everything truthfully in the book, had his own agenda, had connections to weird figures like the Lyndon LaRouche crowd, but he did do some important pioneering work. And then Nick Bryant's book, I would say, is the more scrupulously documented, well corroborated book, and certainly for anyone who wants to get into Franklin for the first time, I would absolutely recommend Bryant's as the best source of information there is.
Yeah, I was gonna say, if anybody's read John DeCamp's one, definitely check out Nick Bryant's. I think it's probably almost twice the size too, right?
Yeah,
I mean, there's a lot in there.
I know, it goes all over the place, all over the country, and Bryant was able to corroborate a lot of things that even DeCamp was not, such as the direct connection to Washington, to Washington D.C. and the CIA's, and using this as a sexual blackmail ring, stuff that DeCamp only hinted at in his book because he couldn't outright prove it, and proving that Gary Caradori was getting pictures, blackmail pictures in Chicago. So there are a lot of key things that DeCamp, hints at that are he says, is most likely true, that Bryant is able to establish pretty much beyond a reasonable doubt in his book.
Gotcha. Yeah. So, but what I was getting at, and I don't know if maybe because it's just the way the days, times are now, it's so much easier for people to massively, see stuff, with the internet. Maybe back then, not many people saw whatever happened to be on the TV or in the newspapers, but like it really didn't get much of anything of like what it deserved, So I think going back to these stories that kind of just like popped up and got swept under the rug, I think it's good to talk about that shit, even though it's old. It's nice to, I think when we see like they were doing this 30 years ago, what the fuck you think they're doing now?
Yeah, and I mean, they never got punished for it. In fact, I mean, Franklin, it was absolutely insane, and that they had a grand jury impaneled, and pretty much all the child abusers were completely let off the hook. They wrote a very disinformational grand jury report saying all these people were innocent, they were falsely accused, this whole thing was a carefully crafted hoax, and then they actually indicted two of the victims for perjury because they wouldn't recant their stories, and sent one of them, Alicia Owen, to prison for nearly 10 years.
That was horrible.
Yeah, if they can do that and, absolutely twist reality, turn it on its head, and punish kids who are brave enough to come forward, why would you think they're going to stop? It's only going to get worse and worse because now they've proven that this can be covered up and you can completely invert the reality of what happened. And I think that it unfortunately has kept on going, and it will keep on going until you can, make people realize the extent of this darkness and have them come to terms with it.
It's wild. Amber Heard lies and she gets a $10 million fine that she'll probably never pay, and this chick lies and she gets 10 years in jail. But she didn't lie. But they were saying she lied.
Right. Yeah, I mean,
what the fuck?
It's ridiculous. I mean, they needed to make an example out of Alicia, and as well, they also had the other kid, Paul Bonacci, on perjury charges. Just after they barely managed to convict Alicia Owen, they suddenly dropped the charges against Bonacci, and they say, we don't need to try him anymore. But Bonacci was saying all the same things that Alicia Owen was, that he had the same very much overlapping perjury charges. The grand jury said he was the most pathetic witness, so you'd think it would be even easier to convict him than it would be to convict Alicia Owen. But it seems that they weren't going to it was already hard enough to convict Alicia Owen. They originally had some jurors who were holding out and not wanting to convict, so they only got her by the skin of her teeth. They were not going to roll the dice a second time with Bonacci, but that goes to show that this was never actually about, some sort of justice, about punishing people who lied. It was all about sending a message to kids saying, you tell the truth about your abuse, this is what'll happen to you. We can put you in jail and we'll go on living our lives. And it is absolutely sickening.
And now, wasn't there another kid? I know when we covered the Franklin cover-up, I think there was 3 people that we used. And didn't he, his brother die and then he died?
Yeah, that was Troy Bonner. That was really sad story. Troy Bonner was he was a friend of Alicia Owens in this ring as well. He was another victim, and initially he and Alicia and also their friend Danny King all came forward and told their story to the investigator Gary Kiradori, and ultimately the Omaha FBI started bringing the pressure down on all these people to recant, and Troy Bonner and Danny King both succumbed to that. They recanted their stories of abuse. They said that the investigator Gary Kiradori had just fed them a story to say, and this is absolutely not true. Nick Bryant's book shows very clearly why this is false. They tell a version of events.
Oh shit! What happened? You all right?
Yeah, no, I'm good.
Oh, no, I thought I heard something fall, and then it went silent. I was like, "Was this guy's mic just fall over? He fell out of his chair." I'm sorry.
No, I'm good over here.
I was like, shit. No, I thought I heard a bang, and I was like, or something pop, and I was like, "Fuck, this guy's mic just popped or broke."
Yeah. Well. Yeah. I mean. Anyway, yeah. So Troy Bonner, and Danny King, for example, claimed that there was a phone call that Alicia Owen had, that Alicia Owen had made, that telling them the story, telling him about the story of the hoax, and they had phone records for the jail where Alicia Owen was incarcerated. There was no record of the phone call. They then supposedly Troy Bonner told the story to Danny King at a bar at a hotel that didn't even have a bar. So it was basically obviously that they had a story that was completely made up, of how this hoax got started. But yeah, Troy Bonner ultimately started having second thoughts about his recantation, tried to come forward again, and as soon as he did that, with having those thoughts, his brother Sean Bonner, his older brother, died in a suspicious game of Russian roulette at a housing right by Offutt Air Force Base. Offutt being the Offutt Air Force Base itself is implicated as a part of the Franklin network, where certain kids were being subjected to mind control type experiments, and an airman at Offutt Air Force Base had supplied the gun that was resulted in Sean Bonner's death.
Is that the same Air Force Base that there's kids making accusations that have left there from I think the daycare and gone to Michael Aquino's house outside of the base?
So you're thinking of Presidio in California, but yes. However, there is somewhat of a connection, at least according to Paul Bonacci, one of the Franklin victims. Paul Bonacci did say that he was subjected to experimentation at Offutt, and that Michael Aquino was one of the people who, his so-called programmers, for these mind control projects. And Bonacci also did claim that he was taken to the Presidio base, that he was taken to Aquino's house, and he was also able to describe the house of Aquino relatively accurately. So it does appear that there is a likely connection between Presidio and Offutt with these kinds of operations.
Gotcha. Do you think, I know some people have thought that maybe out of all 3 of those people, Troy might have been kind of the most maybe fantastical or bullshit, I guess.
I think most of the time, I think people thought that Paul Bonacci was the most fantastical because he was talking about being a victim, being in a snuff film. He was talking about he was one of the people who implicated.
I've heard people discredit Troy because of drug use. That's why.
Well, yeah. I mean, Troy was. Troy, and the problem is that a lot of these victims were, just by the nature of their abuse, what they get lured into, it kind of leads to them being discredited, which is the saddest part of all, that they often only get turned on to drugs or get into this sort of underworld, get Paul Bonacci, for example, he later ended up being arrested for molesting a cousin of his, and I mean, obviously, there's no condoning or defending that, but you have to think about how a little kid who has been abused pretty much since childhood, who gets to thinking that this kind of stuff is normal, almost, that you have to think about how that'll screw up someone's head. And so a lot of these kids, as a result of their trauma, later end up becoming, criminals themselves, or doing things that give them, reasons why you can say, well, their memories are not that good, or their mental state is imbalanced. Paul Bonacci having dissociative identity disorder, and so it becomes the rationale not to trust them, when in fact they're suffering this trauma and exhibiting these signs honestly lends credence to the story that they have suffered a horrible degree of abuse.
Oh, well, I mean, in my opinion, like what happens, these sick fucks, if they were to find a kid and they already had a drug problem, they'd be like, oh, that's even a plus. Because now we'll just supply them drugs. Or just going through this stuff and dealing with what's going on in your head, I would see drug addiction being a side effect of just the wrong choice of how to deal with that. So, like, right, I would see, like, the drugs really getting into the situation or after the situation would just be a common possibility.
Yeah, it is both. I mean, yeah, kids who have those problems can very easily get lured into it. And, some of these, abusers like, Alan Bayer, for example, they would, give these kids some amount of money for, sexually servicing them. And so, if they already had these dependencies, they might think, oh, this is a great way to, fulfill that. But, it really is just ripping out more and more of their soul. And that's just, really sick to see how these kids just get exploited. And, then ultimately their exploitation is what supposedly turns them into non-credible witnesses. So then people have an excuse not to listen to them. It's like, oh, look at these pillars of the community, these respectable businessmen like Alan Bayer or Harold Anderson, the newspaper publisher in Omaha, or Gene Mahoney, the parks commissioner, Robert Wadman, the police chief, all these people. Like, how could you believe this damaged kid, this drug addicted or, mentally ill kid over this, obviously respectable man, but, it's not that, it doesn't work that way. The kids are, end up the way they are because of these quote unquote respectable people doing the sickest things imaginable.
Yeah, the only reason I had asked about Troy, because I know a lot of people, when I was looking into the Franklin scandal, I think I included Troy's stuff as well. But at first I was a little iffy because I know a lot of people wanted to kind of blow him off about, because of drug use and stuff. But the fact of, like, him and his brother, like you even said, I mean, that just, I don't know. I mean, is that all coincidental? But I mean, that just seems kind of fucking shady to me. I
mean, I do find it hard to believe that it is. And I mean, ultimately the strength
And would you see they were playing fucking Russian roulette on a fucking army base?
Yeah, it was a very weird story.
It's fucking Christopher Walken in there flipping the fucking gun.
I know. There is an interview that I think the guy's name was Michael Brownell, who was actually at the scene when this happened. A man named David Schurter did an interview with him on the Opperman Report, and basically, there was some very suspicious conduct at that, behind the nature of how Sean Bonner ended up getting shot in this game of Russian roulette, to the point where it appears to have been, somewhat orchestrated that he would end up in that, in that situation getting shot. So I think that there is absolutely something fishy about Sean's death, and Troy and all of his family, per his affidavit and affidavits of family members, if I recall correctly, certainly did take what happened to Sean as a sign, the worrying sign of what would happen if Troy undid his recantation and came forward. And ultimately, that's the tragic thing too, that Troy did. At one point, he was going to show up at Alicia Owen's appeal to testify, I lied, in her trial, and hopefully help get her a new trial, because he was one of the main witnesses against her. And then he was a no-show. He basically vanished for the next 10 years, and then he also turns up dead in this hospital in Texas, also in very suspicious circumstances, just having some sudden bleeding episode or whatever, and he's just dead as well. So I do think that is unfortunately the fate that befalls many of these victims if they try to say too much about what they experienced.
For sure. No, I definitely think, I mean, even when we covered the Franklin scandal, I mean, I think, I don't know how many parts we did, like maybe 3. I don't know, but we probably could have done like at least probably double what we put out, but it was just like, how far off do we want to go with this? But there is so much shit that like seems like that spider web comes out of that. And I guess one of the things that I stumbled upon why looking into that is Johnny Gosch. And that was the main reason why you're coming on. I'm sorry I got you dragged off with all the other stuff. But first, by the way, you did plug your stuff. Your links are in the bottom, so if people want to go check out his stuff, I did add some of his links in the bottom already. Forgot to mention that in the beginning. But if you want to try to get back to where we were supposed to go with like Johnny Gosch, and maybe explain a little bit of Johnny Gosch to people who may not fully understand, and like, I'm even sure what I think I know about Johnny Gosch probably isn't like much of what you could explain right now too. So,
sure, yeah. Basically, the reason why Johnny Gosch comes up in connection with Franklin is because, as I mentioned, Paul Bonacci, one of the victims of Franklin, while he was incarcerated, and he had his lawyer John DeCamp, he had made some sort of statement at one point in some interview, I believe psychiatric interview, saying that there was some incident he was involved in with this newspaper carrier in Des Moines, Iowa, and in about 1982. And John DeCamp looked into this and found, oh wow, there was something that happened with the Des Moines newspaper carrier in 1982, and that was the abduction of Johnny Gosch. And so Paul Bonacci ultimately was checked out for the story, and Johnny Gosch's parents and the investigators who evaluated the story did find a fair amount of evidence for Paul Bonacci being truthful about that and indicating that there was a connection between Johnny and the Franklin network. But to back it up, it was about nearly 10 years before Bonacci came forward and go through the history of the Johnny Gosch abduction. That in and of itself is somewhat illuminating, and points even before Bonacci came forward, there are signs pointing to Johnny being taken into human trafficking. So Johnny Gosch was a 12-year-old newspaper carrier in West Des Moines, Iowa, delivered newspapers every Sunday morning for the Des Moines Register. He was universally described as a great kid, friendly to everyone, willing to defend his neighbors from bullies. There were many accounts that people from around the neighborhood gave to Noreen, like, I remember your son like this. So he was a great kid, and he had gotten his job at a paper route about 13 months prior to his abduction, so that he could get he could make enough money to get a dirt bike that he really wanted. So he had been doing this for about a year, and up until that point, basically he would go out in the early morning, pick up papers at a drop spot, and then deliver them around his neighborhood. Every Sunday morning, up till the point of his abduction, he had his father, Leonard John Gosch, or John Gosch Sr., as sometimes called, go with him, accompany him, because it was early morning, and Johnny was only 11 to 12 years old throughout this time.
And where did you say this happened again?
This was West Des Moines, Iowa.
Oh, all right. I was, he's real bugged out. This is where my mind goes. For some reason, I was thinking Illinois or Chicago. So I looked up the fucking game Paperboy, and it came out in 1985, and I was like, where was the company that made the game? And it was in Chicago, Illinois.
I mean, there were other throughout the Midwest.
Made me think of that fucking video game Paperboy for a second. And I was like, that game's old as fuck. When did that come out?
Yeah, I mean, I would think that at that time, the notion of a paperboy was kind of on the decline just after these publicized incidents. It certainly would not last much longer for a while, because people were starting to become aware of the dangers that some of these kids were facing. But yeah, back in 1982, it certainly was a normal thing to be happening, and not just in Des Moines, throughout the U.S. and certainly in many places in the Midwest. So yeah, Johnny was delivering these papers for over a year, making good money, had a perfect service record, and he's on the day before his kidnapping, that would have been September 4th, 1982. So, just so people know, we're actually coming up on this Monday on the 40th anniversary of when Johnny was kidnapped. But yeah, Johnny on the Sunday before his abduction, the Saturday night before his abduction, he asked his parents, "Hey, can I do the paper route by myself? I think I'm old enough." And Johnny's father initially said, "Oh yeah, okay, sure." And then Noreen, his mother, was basically like, "No, our agreement was always that you do that you do it when you're accompanied by your dad, and that's we're gonna stick to that." So Johnny was like, "Okay," went to bed, came back down, a little bit later, gave his mom another hug, said, "You're the best." And unfortunately, the next day, September 5th, 1982, that morning, Johnny Gosch set out on his own. Did not wake up his mom, his dad. Just went out did the route by himself. And so there are witness accounts from that morning gathered by police, and I mean, before the police were even on the scene, gathered by Noreen herself, who had taken the initiative to call up all these witnesses and realize what happened after she found out that Johnny had been kidnapped. Basically, the witness accounts paint this sort of picture that around right before 6 a.m., a couple minutes before 6 a.m., Johnny basically got his wagon that he would use to carry the papers, and he pulled the wagon through the backyard of his house, past a church, and also past another neighbor's house who ended up hearing Johnny at that time pulling the wagon. And so Johnny ended up on Ashworth Road. And so Johnny started walking east on Ashworth Road toward the intersection of Ashworth Road and 42nd Street, which was a north-south street cutting through it. And this was the location where the paper drop was, where the papers would be delivered for the paper boys to pick them up and then go to their respective locations and start delivering them to all the houses. So as Johnny was walking up Ashworth Road, there was a weird, blue car, started driving by Johnny, and basically, seemed like it was trying to get a good look at this kid who was walking there. And once it, sort of noticed Johnny, it then basically, turned around and, doubled back on itself so that it could end up at the corner of 42nd and Ashworth Road, where Johnny arrived to get his papers, and where there were a couple other paper boys as well, one by the name of Mike Seskis. There was also an adult man, a lawyer by the name of John Rossi, who was picking up papers on behalf of his son.
I think I've heard of Rossi deliver before.
Yeah, I mean, it'll get confusing when we talk about Gacy, because there's another guy named Rossi from the John Wayne Gacy case.
Okay, my bad. Wow.
Yeah, it's all good. I mean, it does get confusing sometimes, especially dealing with, all happening in the Midwest, not too far from each other. So you're going to run into some of these names again and again. But yeah, John Rossi, this local lawyer, was there at the paper drop spot. Mike Seskis was there. And basically, both of these witnesses observed this guy in the blue car come over to the paper drop location and approach the kids who were there and sort of ask them for directions on how to get to some location. And there was just something about the demeanor of this guy that really weirded the people out, especially weirded Johnny out. And he started having these second thoughts and was like, I want to get out of here. And this person in the blue car, was described as sort of heavy set, and I guess average height, 5'9", Latino looking guy, dark skin, black hair, mustache, and also described as having some sort of weird item on the seat of the passenger seat of his car, which almost appeared to be a kind of manila envelope, possibly, which is also interesting later in retrospect. But this guy, after getting directions from these paper boys at the scene, he appeared to drive away, appeared to keep on driving east on Ashworth past the paper drop location. And so Johnny decided to set out on his own, but so Johnny started walking north up 42nd Street to get to the intersection of 42nd and Marquardt Lane, which was where he began his paper deliveries. Now, before this guy in the blue car drove away, he flicked his dome lights 3 times in succession. And right around, as soon as that started happening, as soon as he flicked those dome lights, this other individual came out of the shadows on 42nd Street, like out from between 2 houses, sort of among the foliage, and began following behind Johnny at a distance. And so Johnny was walking down 42nd Street, not knowing that this man, who Mike Seska saw and was described as a very tall man, was following Johnny down the road. So Johnny ended up turning onto 42nd Street, and at that point there was another group of paper boys, the Boson brothers, Kevin and Mark Boson, who saw Johnny as they were going up 42nd Street. They passed Marquardt Lane. They saw Johnny on his wagon, and he appeared to be, slumped over for whatever reason, almost as if he was sick. And then after that, there's a witness right on Marquardt Lane by the name of P.J. Smith, who basically looks out his window, and there are a couple different accounts about what P.J. Smith saw, which also is kind of interesting. Initially, it was reported that P.J. Smith, looked out his window, he heard a car door slam, and then looked out, saw a car driving away. Basically, a car drove out of Marquardt Lane and then turned left, which would take them north on 42nd Street towards the interstate, and which at that point they would have been able to get out of town as far away as they needed to. So later on, there actually came out, according to Noreen, that P.J. Smith had seen even more, that P.J. Smith had actually seen the entire abduction take place, had actually looked out the window, saw Johnny being forced into that car, that same blue car, before it sped away, but at least, and then that he was intimidated by police to change his story about that. But at least at that point, back in 1982, the early 80s, the only witness account was that P.J. Smith saw the aftermath, saw the car driving away and peeling out, running a stoplight, and going north on 42nd towards the interstate. So, Johnny, and at that point, Johnny's wagon's just left behind on Marquardt, and Johnny is nowhere to be found. He's completely vanished. His papers are still there. The dachshund who he came with was also just there, and it ended up running away back to the Gosch home, which is about a block away. And so Johnny's parents were
Did they end up finding that there? Sorry to interrupt you real quick. It's just something.
Finding what?
Did they ended up can they corroborate that they actually found the newspapers in his wagon there too, when they were investigating?
Yeah.
Looking for him?
Yeah, that's all they found. Basically.
Oh, okay. So they even did find that in the spot that, in the story that you're telling me now.
Yeah, because basically what had happened was, all these customers were phoning the Gosch parents and being like, "Why didn't I get my paper?" And so Johnny's dad, set out, and he basically went to the spot, where Johnny would find the deliveries, found Johnny's wagon, and parent reportedly went back home and called, basically told Noreen, Johnny is missing, call the police. And then Johnny's dad went out and started, delivering the rest of Johnny's papers. So basically Noreen called the police, said, my son is missing. And according to Noreen and Leonard John Gosch both say this, that the police really didn't seem to care all that much. It took them 45 minutes to even show up at the house. So in the meantime, Noreen herself started calling called the paper company, got names of the people who were there at the paper drop location at 42nd and Ashworth, and got their name and started contacting them, getting statements from people like John Rossi and Mike Seskis about what had occurred that morning. So already got a sense of what happened to Johnny, about the suspicious man who approached him at the paper drop in the blue car, and then the other man who started following Johnny down the road. But the police, when they finally did arrive, they basically, the first question they asked was, "Well, has your son ever run away before?" They really seemed intent on treating it as if Johnny had just run away, that there was no abduction at all. And in light of the accounts of people like John Rossi and Mike Seskis about two suspicious men clearly being involved with Johnny right before he vanished, and also having this mysterious blue car that was seen approaching Johnny be peeling out from the exact spot where Johnny's wagon was found, and Johnny is nowhere in sight, it seems rather unbelievable that they didn't view this as a kidnapping, because that's obviously what it pointed to. But the police basically kept maintaining, and really continue to maintain even to this day, that there is no evidence that Johnny was actually kidnapped. They still treat it as a missing person, not as a kidnapping, which is just maddening.
Kid ran away.
Yeah, they still try to, or they at least say, well, we can't rule it out. That Johnny just ran away, which is absurd. I mean, Johnny had no history of that, and putting all the facts together, it's really hard to conclude anything other than that Johnny was kidnapped. But the police, for whatever reason, were maintaining that Johnny might have just been a runaway. In fact, according to Noreen, the police chief, a man named Orville Cooney, who not long before Johnny's abduction, Orville Cooney had been called out by his police department for all sorts of corruption. All sorts of members of the West Des Moines Police Department are saying, this guy is drinking on the job. There are police brutality complaints against him, beating up suspects, that he apparently fixed some tickets on behalf of his son to get his son out of trouble. That Orville Cooney was very reviled by the police department up until that point, at least a lot of members of the West Des Moines Police Department. He appeared to be a very imbalanced man, and he would, after he left the police department, he would be found shoplifting from Target in 1987. He shoplifted these screw hooks and also some blank videotapes for whatever reason from a Target store. But basically, Orville Cooney, according to Noreen, basically on the day that Johnny was kidnapped, when search parties were going out, Orville Cooney got on top of a picnic table and basically yelled, "Go home, everyone, the kid's just a damn runaway." He was apparently drunk at the time. So this is the police chief. This is the guy who's in charge of the police department, basically setting the tone of don't care about this kid. So, Noreen quickly realized the tone that the investigation was going to take, and began looking for private investigators of her own. The Gosch family hired some PIs who started following various leads around the neighborhood. They started canvassing the neighborhood and getting all these witnesses to speak, and not just the witnesses at the paper drop. They fanned out across the neighborhood, and also managed to get other people who had seen suspicious things that morning, even several blocks away, who you might not think to connect to the kidnapping, but just seeing if anyone in the area saw anything weird. And that did turn up some interesting things that we'll get into a bit later when we get to the Paul Bonacci story, because that, some of what they found was stuff that Paul Bonacci corroborated, even though they had never publicized it at the time. But essentially, Noreen and her husband started...
That's one thing I do want to say about Paul Bonacci is that, I think if people were to listen to his testimonies, he's very fucking detailed.
Yeah, that's one thing that really stands out. And Paul
Even
Bonacci,
Troy Boner was a little bit. I think he was on the corner of this and that's across the street. He visually could see where they were talking about. That's how descriptive to me they were. They were actually picturing this place in their mind, because they were talking about everything around them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that Paul Bonacci in particular gets a bad rap for not being a credible witness, even though the level of detail that he can say about these cases is pretty extraordinary. And he also is willing to say, well, I don't know, if he's asked a question about something he's not sure of. Yeah, he did say
that a lot, actually. If he doesn't know, he just says, I don't know.
Yeah, which I think that makes sense. And ultimately, as we'll get into, you can just see the the facts of the case and the things that Bonacci knew that he would have had no reasonable way of knowing unless he really was involved, because this was stuff that was found by the Gosches in their investigation and then never released to the media, and yet here Bonacci is knowing all of this stuff. But back at that time, when everything was just starting out, the Gosches didn't really know where to turn. They had all sorts of potential leads that could follow. They had tip lines, and people would call in And sometimes they would give valuable information, but a lot of times it would just be a crank, or even worse, sometimes people who just wanted to torment the family. There were a lot of sickos out there who would just like call the Gosches and say, "Your son's dead," and then start laughing at them and hang up. Which, it's hard to imagine, but that is what they had to endure. But so, I mean, sorting out the wheat from the chaff of the leads that they were getting was obviously become essential, and that's what their private investigators were responsible for doing for the next several years. So actually, a couple months after Johnny is kidnapped, there is a sighting of Johnny, what would appear to be a very likely sighting of Johnny in Oklahoma, where basically this woman ends up having this, she sees this kid who's about 13, looks about 13 years old in her estimation. The kid runs up to her and says, "Help me, I'm John David Gosch." And then suddenly these two men come and just start dragging this kid away. So this woman, understandably, is like, "What the hell?" And she reports this to the police, the local police in Oklahoma, and they say, "Oh, this is probably just a family situation." So, I mean, that seems a bit weird, but whatever. This woman, moves on. She's like, "I did my duty. I reported it," and she ends up.
At that time, was his disappearance kind of like known? Like
it was
like nationwide, because like I not to give them any excuse, but back then, someone missing somewhere else may not show up in their system. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it probably was not. I don't know if it was super well known at the time. Just there was less sort of connectedness, and the West Des Moines Police Department was already not great about putting Johnny into the NCIC database in the first place, according to Noreen. So I'm not actually sure whether the police department in Oklahoma knew about Johnny. It is somewhat strange that they would immediately take that as well as just a domestic thing. No need to worry about it at all.
Oh yeah,
but
I still think that's weird too. But I thought maybe they might have like known at least from the TV, but maybe they didn't.
Yeah, well, it's important to know at that point, no one actually made the connection that this was a missing kid. The woman did not. It's actually only later where. So later on, the woman, I mean, if she hears the name John David Gosch and, doesn't know what that means, she doesn't, at that point in 1983, there's not really a means of looking that up and seeing it. So if you haven't heard it, you haven't heard it, and it doesn't mean anything to you. But later that year, this woman was watching a documentary about the Adam Walsh case, and this documentary at one point talked about a lot of other missing kids in the country as well. And one of them was Johnny Gosch. And as soon as, Johnny Gosch and the picture and the name came up on screen, this woman was like, "Oh shit, I know this kid. I saw this kid. He was the one who was dragged away by these two men that I saw." And so she re-reported it to police, and this time was like, "This kid I saw was a missing kid." And at that point, the report finally made its way to the Gosch's private investigators. There was some firm out of Chicago, the Investigative Research Agency, who was working for them at the time, and the investigative research agency, the Gosch PIs, checked out this lead. They actually checked it out in conjunction with the FBI, and both the PIs and the FBI came to the conclusion that this was a genuine sighting of Johnny Gosch. So already 6 months after Johnny is taken, you have evidence that Johnny is still alive in another state. And already you have to think about that and realize, well, what does this point to as the most likely scenario for why Johnny was abducted, and what kind of entity might have abducted him? A lot of people are inclined to say, well, Johnny was probably just taken by some lone pervert and killed immediately. And, it's one, to some extent, if you go off the statistics of what happens to missing children, this does unfortunately seem to be a common end for many of these kids. And so it can seem on the surface, logical to think that way, but you can't just take a statistic of, an overall statistic about these cases and try to apply it to every single case if you have evidence from the case that directly contradicts that. And in this case, it clearly appears that Johnny was not killed immediately. And if he wasn't killed immediately, but he was still somehow in captivity, having these suspicious men drag him away, what that almost certainly on its own starts to point to a human trafficking type of conclusion. So even at that point early on, it appeared very likely that Johnny was taken into taken into some kind of child trafficking network, and that was the underlying cause of his abduction. And later on in 1985, there's another one of these, sort of proofs of life, as I call them, where there was a dollar bill that was found circulating in western Iowa, around Sioux City, Iowa. It had a message written on it that said, "I am alive," and then signed Johnny Gosch. And this dollar bill made its way to the Gosches, who ended up hiring some handwriting experts, 3 handwriting experts, to look at the writing on the bill, compare it against known exemplars of Johnny's own handwriting, and they all came to the conclusion that this really was Johnny's handwriting. So it's another compelling sign that Johnny was, that Johnny was still out there, still alive, and was trying to get any sort of message that he could out there. So certainly, just looking at the evidence even before Paul Bonacci comes on the scene, there is some good reason to believe that Johnny Gosch was a victim of child trafficking. And the other major dimension of that is the emergence of a very suspicious figure on the scene by the name of Sam Soda. Sam Soda was a private investigator in Des Moines, and sometime in early to mid 1984, Sam Soda essentially tried to insert himself into the Johnny Gosch investigation. Tried to call in the Gosches and offer information, try to have them enlist him to do work for them. So essentially, according to Noreen, and she's told the story relatively consistently from 1988 onwards. Again, 1988 is even before Paul Bonacci came forward. So according to Noreen, this guy, Sam Soda, called her into his office one day on it was in mid-June of 1984, and he actually tells Noreen that there is going to be another kidnapping of another paperboy, this time on the south side of Des Moines, and that it was going to take place in the second weekend in August. And Sam Soda even allowed Noreen to tape her as she said this for whatever reason. And so the spookiest thing about this is that ultimately Sam Soda's prediction came to pass, that on the second weekend in August, another paperboy named Eugene Martin, also worked for the Des Moines Register, also was similar age to Johnny. He was 13 years old. He was similar physical description to Johnny, same sort of hair color, look alike in terms of hair color and general physical appearance. Eugene Martin, was also taken under cover of early morning darkness and just pretty much completely vanished. So you basically had another parallel case to Johnny's, another paperboy vanishing in very similar circumstances, happening exactly when this guy Sam Soda predicted it would. And up before the kidnapping of Eugene, Noreen was trying to tell the police about this, and they basically didn't care. They refused to listen to the tape recording that she made of Sam Soda for whatever reason. So, obvious question, who is Sam Soda and what the hell is he up to? Well, Sam Soda has a very interesting history in that he, around this time in around September of 1984, he incorporated this organization called Stolen Children Are Reported Every Day, or just SCARED for short, which supposedly was trying to be this advocacy group informing citizens about the risks of human trafficking, the risks of child pornography, and supposedly was doing a good civic service for the community. But what's weird about it is that at his conferences, Sam Soda was actually showing real child pornography to his audiences, right in front of everyone. There were even Des Moines police in his audience that he was showing the child pornography to, and yet somehow he was getting away with it scot-free. He actually, the first assistant county attorney, man by the name of Ron Wheeler, had actually, basically not only did nothing about it, but according to Sam would later go on a podcast in 2018 about the Johnny Gosch case and say, "Oh yeah, this guy, Ron Wheeler, called me into his office, and he said I should tell you to stop showing child pornography, but instead I'm giving you my blessing to continue." So again, what the fuck? Why is this guy Sam Soda able to show child pornography right in front of police officers that is clearly illegal and be protected by the local county attorney's office for doing this? And also, how are they able to get this child pornography in the first place? What kind of connections does he have? Well, Sam Soda, as Noreen and her husband at the time would find out, Sam Soda did have a lot of interesting connections. And I've personally, corroborated this as well from people who knew Sam Soda, that Sam Soda had mafia connections. He was associated with Johnny Farrell and that whole crew in Des Moines, on the south side of Des Moines. He also had these law enforcement connections throughout the country. He did work for the Ruan Trucking Company out of Des Moines, which Ruan, it employed some interesting people. Like they employed this guy, Larry Miller. Larry Miller was the president of Ruan. He had a history of studying at the Military Intelligence School in Washington, D.C. And by the way, Ruan is based at street number 666 in Des Moines, curiously enough.
Wow.
But yeah. So these are just some of the connections that Sam Soda had, and he was able to get away with showing child pornography in public, and which is obviously shocking. Then later that year, Sam Soda also he exposes some guy, this pedophile who works for the Des Moines Register, as an adult paper carrier by the name of Frank Sikora, and he basically, he somehow gets Sikora to confess on tape that he molested a ton of paper boys. And as for how Sam was able to get this guy to admit to something awful like that willingly on tape is not really easy to understand. And Frank Sikora would later say that Sam had actually lied. It impersonated a Iowa Department of Criminal Investigations agent, impersonated a state police agent, and basically coerced him into giving this statement. And Sam Soda would maintain, "Oh, that's not true. I had another journalist in the room with me who, checked everything I was doing and made sure I was honest." But turns out the journalist was later spoken to, and the journalist actually contradicted Sam's story and said I was not in the room with him. So once again, there's a sign of some funny business where Sam, he's able to find this random pedophile who works for the Register that no one has ever heard of before, and then he's able to pass them off. He tries to pass off Frank Sikora as, sort of as a suspect in Johnny's abduction, even though Frank Sikora turns out, really has no discernible connection that can be found to Johnny's abduction other than just happening to be a pedophile at the Des Moines Register, at the newspaper. So Sam Soda that appears to be involved in trying to set up this false suspect. And by the way, mysteriously, Frank Sikora initially, he pleads not guilty. Then like a month later, there's a mysterious fire that breaks out at Sikora's apartment. It's literally called in newspaper articles a, quote, fire of suspicious origin that breaks out at Sikora's address. And then shortly thereafter, Frank Sikora just pleads guilty and silently goes away, and the whole thing gets buried. So, a lot of weird stuff going on with Sam, his ability to get child pornography, his ability to be protected for sharing child pornography, Sam Soda's underworld connections, Sam Soda's apparent knowledge to some extent of the Des Moines pedophile underworld, the fact that he's able to find this pedo at the Des Moines Register and, try to push them forward to the Johnny Gosch abduction and Eugene Martin abduction suspect, and also obviously his foreknowledge of Eugene Martin's kidnapping before it happened. So all this stuff was very, very suspicious to Noreen Gosch and her husband at the time, Leonard John Gosch. And so they viewed Sam Soda as a very, as a prime suspect in Johnny's kidnapping for a while. So already they were starting to hone in on this guy and feel that he was very much a suspicious figure in the case. And the sort of lay dormant, that they tried to investigate Sam Soda, and actually around 1986 when they were trying to investigate Sam and intensifying their heat on him, the Gosches started getting threats to their house. They would have people who would call them in the middle of the night, and then later on, soon after the calls, people would come by the house, throw rocks at their house. They would get overt threats over the phone, people threatening them, threatening their families. They would and then it culminated in a really bizarre thing where Noreen Gosch was essentially, was being lured to a meeting in Tulsa, Oklahoma with some guy who claimed to have knowledge of Johnny's abduction. and he basically said, meet me in Tulsa, meet me at this hotel, and I'll give you information. And then almost immediately after Noreen got the call, the police department gets the call saying a hit has been placed on Noreen. She's being lured into a trap. And ultimately, they sent someone in Noreen's place, a police officer, to pose as her, and then they arrested this guy who was trying to meet with Noreen. And the guy named forget the exact name of this guy at the moment, but he basically said that he tried to say that he had information on. Oh yeah, sorry. The guy's name was David James Schultz, initially of Syracuse, New York, and David James Schultz claimed to have information on a crime that involved organized crime figures and federal agents, but his claims about that were dismissed. So you have another guy who appears to be somewhat linked to organized crime circles who is trying to lure Noreen into a trap, and this happened as soon as she started intensifying the heat on Sam Soda. So already, and this is years before Paul Bonacci comes forward, just between all these things, between the proofs of life about Johnny indicating that he's been taken into trafficking, between Sam Soda, you have all these indications that something is not right about what happened with Johnny. There's some kind of organized network, some kind of organized pedophile network that is active in Des Moines, but clearly able to pull its weight elsewhere as well, that is able to, seemingly motivated to get away with what's going on. And that was the sort of realization that Noreen and her husband had, but they couldn't quite put the pieces together. And then Paul Bonacci comes forward and really breaks open the case for them.
Damn, there you go. That was like a really fucking detailed shit right there. Fuck.
Yeah, no,
like that's like some real fucking wild spider web of just rant. Fuck, that's crazy.
Yeah, and honestly, this is something that I feel like a lot of people, when you hear about Johnny Gosch's connection to Franklin, if you only hear the side of, well, Paul Bonacci told this story, it can be easy for people to just say, well, why do I believe Paul Bonacci? But it's very important, in my view, to get the whole background about what was happening with Johnny in West Des Moines and Des Moines area beforehand, because that really shows you the extent to which there already were signs of a human trafficking ring being involved even before that, and that Paul Bonacci really just fills in the blanks of a story that the Gosches were already onto previously. When Paul Bonacci does come forward, he comes forward in sometime in the year 1990, and John DeCamp, his lawyer, once he realizes a possible connection to Johnny Gosch, he contacts the Gosch home, and he tells, basically, he says, hey, I have a client who's in prison here in Nebraska, and he probably, he seems to have information about Johnny, about your son. The phone was answered by Noreen's husband at the time, and so Leonard John Gosch, basically, he gets the call. He's like, well, I don't know, but I'll go check it out. He does not, however, tell Noreen about this call. He never lets her know about this lead that has just come in from Nebraska. And so he goes to Nebraska. He goes to the Nebraska prison, meets with DeCamp, meets with Bonacci, and also the private investigator that John DeCamp has enlisted at the time, an Omaha PI named Roy Stevens. And basically, he meets with Bonacci, and reportedly, according to DeCamp's book, and this book is later endorsed by Leonard John Gosch as well as being very truthful. So Paul Bonacci, when he sees Johnny's dad, he's like, whoa, the eyes, it can't be. Like, you look like Johnny Gosch. Because, yeah, they did. Leonard John Gosch really does look a lot like a sort of grown-up version of Johnny Gosch, especially at that time. And so Paul Bonacci apparently makes a connection immediately, realizes that he's talking to the dad, and at that time, Leonard John Gosch just indicates that he was blown away by it. And he talked to Bonacci at that prison, came away thinking that Bonacci was credible and sincere. And so from that point on, the PI, Roy Stevens, began checking out various avenues of Bonacci's story. Debriefing Bonacci on tape recordings about what Bonacci claimed happened in the abduction, following down the various leads, and then ultimately and then ultimately this would later come to the attention of Noreen. She would find out about it the next year in March of 1991, and then a little bit after that, the story would sort of break open from there. Now, basically, the scenario that Paul Bonacci gives is that there was this man, this child trafficker by the name of Emilio, who was this heavy-set Latino middle-aged guy, which of course matches the description of the guy who was seen in the blue car approaching Johnny that morning. Bonacci claimed that Emilio was a long-time, participant in this Franklin network whose specialty was abducting children around the country and selling them to other pedophiles who would want them. So Bonacci claimed that he met Emilio as a kid in the Omaha area, and that ultimately, right around the Labor Day weekend when Johnny was abducted, that Emilio basically took him on a trip to a hotel in West Des Moines, Iowa, where at the hotel they met with a couple other people. There was this guy by the name of Tony, who was a tall, thin man with blonde hair, a pockmarked face, and this, by the way, the super tall man description matches the other man who was seen in the neighborhood following Johnny on 42nd Street that morning. So, and then also a man by the name of Sam. So basically, according to Bonacci, there was this whole planning meeting there where this guy by the name of Sam, pulled out a photo album that consists of nothing but photos of paper boys in Des Moines. All paper boys who are carrying that yellow Des Moines Register paper bag, and isolates one photo that is of Johnny Gosch and says, "This is the kid we're going to take tomorrow," and sort of walk through the logistics of what they're going to do to abduct this kid. And basically the logistics being that they're going to drive to the paper location, they're going to approach Johnny, ask him a question, then they're going to have Tony out on foot to follow behind Johnny, while the blue car ends up looping back around, going around the block, to end up back on Marquardt Lane, right at the spot where Johnny is going to be. And then they're going to use the young kid, 15 years old at the time, Paul Bonacci, to essentially approach Johnny, make Johnny let his guard down, while the other guy who is following behind Johnny, Tony, is able to get the jump on Johnny, subdue him, and then they load Johnny into the back seat of the car, the blue car, and then they all drive away. And at that point, so basically, as Paul Bonacci says, that's exactly what occurred. That Paul Bonacci was there hiding out in the back of the car. That the car approached the paper location. Emilio asked asked these paper boys for directions. The car then drove off. Started driving east on Ashworth Road, as the witness accounts would say. Then the car made a U-turn in the middle, U-turn in Ashworth Road, then turned around, started going back west on Ashworth, then so that it could drive up around the block, end up on Marquardt, and all the same time Tony is following behind. The car pulls up right by where Johnny is, where his wagon is, out on Marquardt. Paul Bonacci jumps out of the car, approaches Johnny, and sort of gets his attention. Tony comes up from behind. Johnny is subdued, possibly by the use of a stun gun or other type of mechanism, as Noreen would later find, and potentially something that might explain Johnny initially being seen slumped over in his wagon as if something had happened to him. And then they load Johnny up into the car. They drive off. They go north on 42nd Street. They go about a block away to another location where a van is waiting for them. And this is something that one of the neighbors who was interviewed by the Gosch's private investigators actually saw that morning. He noticed that while he was getting his coffee that morning, there was a van parked in the street with its motor running, and he noticed that, and ultimately, while he was looking at the van, he saw this blue car drive up to the van. He saw people get out of the blue car, load something, they're like wrapped up in a blanket, a fairly large object wrapped up in a blanket, get out, take it out of the blue car, load it into the van, and then both the van and the blue car drove away from the scene. And this was a lead that Noreen got from her PIs. She buried it at the time, didn't actually, tell anyone publicly in the media about this sighting that had happened. And then here comes Paul Bonacci describing pretty much exactly what the witness saw about how Johnny's body, saying that they drove up to a van and then transferred Johnny's body into the van, and then they drove off. And so they drove off, according to Paul Bonacci, they drove off, eventually they got onto the interstates and they drove west through Iowa until they made it to, first stopped at a bar in Council Bluffs, so, to sort of relax, the adults got a drink. And then after that, they drove to a farmhouse near Sioux City, Iowa, which is also western Iowa. And there in Sioux, they came to the farmhouse, which was owned by a man named Charlie. This was apparently some kind of safe house in the Franklin network where they could store these abducted kids for, until there was a buyer who came by and wanted to get Johnny. And so at that point, Johnny and Paul Bonacci were there, and the kidnappers basically ordered Paul Bonacci to actually molest Johnny on camera, which is, absolutely insane. And this was essentially Johnny's first, introduction to the tragic life that he would be leading for the next several years. That ultimately a buyer came to the Sioux City house reportedly and purchased Johnny, a buyer by the name of the Colonel, and took him from there. And so at that point on,
I think I've heard of
Johnny
that name before. Do they sometimes try to associate that with what the fuck is his name? How the hell did I forget?
Michael Aquino?
Yeah, I was gonna say caterpillar eyebrows.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure if that is the case, because the Colonel is a name that is used by a lot of people in this network. I have investigative notes from Roy Stevens where there's another guy who was called the Colonel. There's also, John Wayne Gacy was called the Colonel by people.
Oh, shit.
The pedophile ring operator John Norman was called the Colonel. So,
fuck.
it almost seems like an archetype, a name of a heavy in the trafficking world. It doesn't necessarily mean that it was Michael Aquino. And I guess to be clear as well, Johnny would later show up at being in captivity of the Colonel. I guess I should clarify that it's not 100% clear if the Colonel is the one who purchased Johnny at that point in Sioux City, or if Johnny was passed around from owner to owner in this pedophile ring, and that the Colonel was just one of the later people. But yeah, ultimately Johnny was sold to somebody. The kidnappers made a decent amount of money off of this, and from that point on, Johnny was, according to Paul Bonacci, a member of the Franklin network for quite some time. According to Paul Bonacci, he did later run into Johnny again in March of 1986 when he went on a trip to Colorado, this sort of rural ranch in Colorado where Johnny, Gosch, and a bunch of other kids were held captive in this sort of cavity, this basement. It was dug out underneath the house, and basically, met Johnny at this house supposedly being owned by the Colonel, used to keep these kids before they'd be taken to parties or whatever. And also says that he and Johnny and some of these kids were actually taken out to a Mexican restaurant near Denver at one point. And basically he talks about Johnny being, taken into trafficking, taken into this Franklin network. And
Doesn't Paul and Alicia both have a story of going, I could be wrong, going to Colorado as well? Like they both corroborate that story?
I don't personally remember. I'd have to go back and check the notes because they were taken to a lot of locations. I don't remember if Colorado came up, but it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, I know there was one I thought that they flew out and they both ended up at the same place, but there was 3 of them, and I think Paul got split up, and then Alicia and the other kid went with somebody else, and then they ended up coming back there a few days later and then getting back on the plane, being brought back home. And
I do remember that. I think that was Los Angeles.
Oh, okay. All right.
I'll have to check that. But yeah, Colorado is undoubtedly a center for this sort of thing. There are a lot of weird cases that happened out there. For example, in 2011, this guy named Pat Sullivan, who was the former sheriff of Arapahoe County, he had been the sheriff since 1984. He was a very well-respected figure at the time, was sort of a giant within the law enforcement community. He was friends with both George Bush Sr. and also apparently with Bill Clinton. He was an advisor for Bill Clinton on various crime committees, including, advocate for gun control as well. So he was a very heavy hitter in the Colorado law enforcement community. He had a propensity to show up in all sorts of weird cases, even cases outside of his jurisdiction. He showed up in an important investigative role in the Columbine mass shooting, and he would later, try to discredit a member of his sheriff's office who indicated that a cop had actually shot one of the kids at Columbine, that it wasn't just the two alleged sole perpetrators, Harris and Klebold. And that, Pat Sullivan discredited this guy, ultimately fired him, and said, "I firmly believe there was no cover-up in the Columbine investigation." So that's the kind of stuff that he was into. And it turns out that Pat Sullivan, at the same time, had a hidden side to him, and that he was a meth addict and also was constantly patronizing, having these sexual liaisons with men, but also almost certainly underage boys as well. And basically, he was a pedophile. He was knowingly giving people HIV, not telling them about it. He was really in this decadent lifestyle. And this was the sheriff of the county, a super decorated man, well-respected man, so well-respected that the local jail was named after him. And ironically, he would find himself incarcerated in the Patrick J. Sullivan detention facility, which they soon after realized maybe we shouldn't be naming this after him, and got rid of that. But yeah, he was interrogated by cops, by sheriff's deputies, and he was actually asked, "Do you think you had, contact with any underage boys?" And he was like, "I don't know, I could have," which is not exactly the strongest denial that, I imagine. If he's not even willing to deny it when his image is on the line, I feel pretty confident in saying that he did have these kinds of contacts with underage boys, that he was absolutely a pedophile. And it's a lot of stuff about Pat Sullivan is weird overall. The fact that even after he retired from the sheriff's office, he still kept his key card access to go into the sheriff's office whenever he wanted. They didn't revoke it. And then you want to go really far into it. There's a guy, 9/11 researcher by the name of Jonathan Elenoff, who actually came across. He was the one who broke the Pat Sullivan story in the course of looking into this guy, Delmart Vreeland, who had apparently was an Office of Naval Intelligence guy who predicted 9/11. And Vreeland was also a pedophile in Colorado, and apparently studying Vreeland led him onto the whole network of pedophilia within Colorado, involving Pat Sullivan, but also a massive network of other people. That members of this network, confidential informants who were related to the Pat Sullivan case, had manuals on how to abduct children. They had meth making equipment, mobile meth labs, and this was a massive spider web involving the meth culture, nightclubs that were owned by suspicious businessmen, white supremacists, Denver PD officers being paid off, and mobsters of various stripes. But basically, yeah, not to get too far afield, but that is the kind of thing that does go on in Colorado at very high levels of power. And a lot more stories from that state as well, which certainly lends credence to the notion, to what Bonacci is saying about Johnny being taken to Denver or taken to Colorado. And it is interesting in that, no one would have really thought to bring up Denver. Why? This is a Midwest story. We're talking about Omaha. We're talking about Des Moines. Why would Bonacci pull Colorado out of the hat? But he says it, and it really does appear to check out, given what we later know about the milieu. So anyway, this is a story that Bonacci told to Roy Stevens, and so in March of 1991, Noreen Gosch finally ends up learning about Bonacci. For some reason, when her husband, Leonard John Gosch, found out about it, he doesn't tell Noreen, even as the story is being evaluated. He basically keeps her in the dark about it. But Noreen does find out eventually in the next year. There are differing reports on whether it was her husband who told her or whether it was Roy Stevens who told her. Not totally sure on that myself. I do have my suspicions, which we can possibly get into a bit later. But basically, once Noreen and John were both on the same page of learning about this, it was a good lead for them, but they didn't. But Noreen did not contrary to what people will later say about her trying to discredit Noreen, she did not just jump on the bandwagon and believe Bonacci immediately. She thought it was important to try and check out the story and for its validity. So she and Leonard John Gosch and her husband decided to get a photograph, got a photograph of Sam Soda, the guy who had been their pre-existing suspect from even before Paul Bonacci came forward. They got the photograph of Sam. They sent it to Roy Stevens. They didn't give any identifying information about the photograph. They didn't tell him who it was. They just said, here's a photo, put this in a lineup, and see if Paul Bonacci can identify him. So Roy Stevens did that. He put Sam Soda's photo in a lineup with a bunch of other, unrelated photos, showed it to Paul Bonacci, saw if he knew anything, he could recognize any of the photos, and Paul Bonacci, amazingly enough, picked out the photograph of Sam out of the lineup of a bunch of other photos, picked out the photograph of Sam Soda, said, yeah, this is Sam, because remember when I was talking about the pre-planning of the abduction, there was a guy named Emilio, a guy named Tony, and a guy named Sam. And Paul Bonacci said, yeah, that's Sam, the guy who was involved in the planning. And he's the one who showed us the photo of Johnny Gosch and said he's the kid we're going to take. So, Paul Bonacci was able to match up with evidence about a suspect who the Gosches were already focusing their efforts on even beforehand, which is, honestly incredible. There's really goes to show that there is something real, sincere to his story. And also, I would say, given all the stuff I talked about before about Sam Soda having these underworld connections, having protected, being protected for his involvement in child pornography, and also knowing about a pedophile who was employed by the Des Moines Register that no one else seemed to be aware of, the fact that Sam Soda showed a photo album that consisted solely of paper boys in Des Moines and is very troubling in that sense, and suggests that Sam Soda was sort of a local hookup, a liaison between these interstate people like Emilio and Tony who would go around the country grabbing kids, and also the local pedophile scene, people at the Des Moines Register who were keeping an uncomfortably close eye on these kids and making note of which kids could be targeted for kidnapping, that Sam is essentially, selling these abduction opportunities based on stuff that he knows locally about these perverts, and selling them to members of the Franklin network. And on the topic of the photos, there's another major thing that corroborates Paul Bonacci's story. That Paul Bonacci, when Paul Bonacci talked about the photo, he talks about the photo and he also describes the photo as being, Johnny carrying his paper bag. And this was also amazing to Noreen and her husband at the time, at least, because there was, in fact, a witness who was around the neighborhood who basically it was a couple weeks before Johnny's kidnapping, sometime in August, who saw Johnny as he was walking in the afternoon one day after school. And Johnny, in addition to having his morning paper out, also had an afternoon paper out for, the sort of the daily, papers that would get delivered then. And so this woman actually saw, as Johnny was walking down the street with his paper bag, someone in a car with California plates was snapping pictures of Johnny Gosch. And this was very disconcerting to the woman who noticed this that morning, but she tried to report it to police, and the police said, well, taking pictures is not a crime, which, in all fairness, it's not. I guess you couldn't do much there, but didn't even save the information either. And then so the woman, was like, well, I've done all I can. She unfortunately threw away the license plate number that she had recorded for this car. And so later on, the PIs who are canvassing the neighborhood on behalf of the Gosches come to this woman to get this story about Johnny being photographed in advance. And at this point, the woman sadly doesn't have the license number anymore, so they can't definitively trace it to anybody. But at the very least, they have this piece of information pointing to Johnny being photographed in advance of his kidnapping, and they know the nature of the photo, what Johnny looked like in the photo, and the background, of where he was photographed in front of. So the Gosches bury all of this evidence. They don't tell the public.
Yo, you there? Oh, I think screwing up here.
And he's even able to describe the photograph in, according as the Gosches indicate, really basically perfect detail as to the nature of the photo that was taken, that taken a couple weeks before. That's another major thing where, Johnny simply, Bonacci simply knows too much about the circumstances of Johnny's kidnapping. And, same for, as I mentioned, the van as well, that this is a piece of information that was collected by the PIs and was never made public, what the witness saw. And then suddenly here comes Paul Bonacci, and he's able to talk about it with perfect, accurate detail. So it just becomes clear that there's so much about the logistics of the abduction that is pretty much impossible for Paul Bonacci to just come up with as, a supposed con man, as he would be dismissed as, unless he really, really was aware of this. And then even the house in Colorado that I mentioned, that starts to lead to promising avenues as well. That Roy Stevens was in fact able to find the house in Colorado. He was able to locate it out in rural Colorado, in Buena Vista, Colorado. He was able to find it, and they're actually, in 1993, was a film crew from America's Most Wanted, the TV show that John Walsh was doing at the time. They went out to the house in Colorado, and Paul Bonacci, as soon as he walked up to the house, had a very distinct emotional reaction. He broke down, started crying, and then they went to the basement that I mentioned that was dug out under the house. And creepily enough, they actually found kids' initials that were carved into the wood in that basement corridor underneath the house. So this house that Paul Bonacci talked about Johnny being taken to wasn't just a figment of the imagination. It really existed. At the same time, Paul Bonacci was also getting various letters during his incarceration, from other people he knew through the Franklin Network, and a lot of these letters were making reference to JG or making reference to Johnny. They were talking about the guy Emilio. They were talking about the Colonel. So basically, pretty much talking about, alluding, it would appear, very likely to Johnny. Like, there's one letter that even says JG was not the only boy we got from DM. Probably meaning Johnny Gosch was not the only boy we got from Des Moines, very strongly hinting that Eugene Martin, who I mentioned, was also kidnapped by the same pedophile network as well. And another one of these letters actually made reference to the Mexican restaurant story that I talked about. That Paul Bonacci,
is
Paul
that
Bonacci is
why
not
he actually can describe something that was on a wall?
Yeah, that's what I'm about to sort of get into. Yeah, that basically,
if it wasn't, I was going to ask you about that, if you knew about that.
Yeah. Basically, what happened was at some point in like 1991 or something, like the summer of 1991, I believe, some friends of the Gosches just happened to be out, vacationing, traveling to Denver, whatever. They ate at this Mexican restaurant there. It was the restaurant is Casa Bonita in Lakewood, Colorado, a Denver suburb, and one of them went to the bathroom and they saw this message that said Johnny Gosch was here, written in what would later be found to be the sort of red nail polish on the bathroom wall. And this report made its way back to the Gosches, made its way back to Roy Stevens. So Roy Stevens, he went out to the Mexican restaurant. He took pictures of the message on the wall, but also took pictures of the exterior of the Mexican restaurant. And so Roy Stevens showed these photographs of the restaurant, just the exterior of the restaurant, to Paul Bonacci, and said, "Does this ring a bell to you?" And amazingly enough, Paul Bonacci, as soon as he saw the photos just of the exterior of the Mexican restaurant that Roy Stevens had taken and brought to him, Paul Bonacci was like, "Oh yeah, I went there with Johnny. I was taken there with Johnny. It was like right after they had been at the house in Colorado, the house in Buena Vista. They were taken to this Mexican restaurant. He and Johnny and another kid were there, and Johnny." And basically, at one point, they went into the bathroom. They had been painting their nails with red nail polish, and they wrote on the wall a message. So just from looking at the exterior of the restaurant, not being shown any other, photos of what was inside, what had no other indication of what Roy Stevens was getting at, Paul Bonacci was immediately able to relate this account about the visiting the Mexican restaurant and writing on the walls. And then Paul Bonacci actually was able to produce a letter from one of these other kids in the Franklin Network that actually said, I remember the restaurant in Colorado. We painted our nails, and I wrote on the wall with JG. So, there you have it once again, that Paul Bonacci is simply able to describe a staggering amount of, seemingly intimate detail about the Johnny Gosch case, about the logistics of the abduction, about various sightings and apparent proofs of life for Johnny that, were not really well known before that point. It really is incredible how much Paul Bonacci was able to say that confirmed his connection to Johnny Gosch, confirmed his connection to the abduction. And this ultimately is the, why I think there is no real doubt in my mind that Johnny Gosch was taken by the Franklin Network, was a victim of the Franklin Ring, and was tragically abused by it for a number of years, alongside the many, probably hundreds of other kids in Franklin as well.
Maybe you would know. I'm almost positive. Didn't Paul Bonacci, or maybe not him himself, but didn't the Gosch family and didn't they end up on like some talk show and actually quoted Paul Bonacci as like having information that makes them think that like they whatever, like it sparked it up again, and like didn't they end up on a talk show?
Well, I'm trying to think. I mean, I know that Noreen, and to some extent her husband at the time, Leonard John Gosch, did the sort of media rounds, and they did show up on Inside Edition. They showed up on I think it was the Lisa Gibbons show at one point, some show where Roy Stevens and Noreen both showed up there together, and they even had a phone call to Paul Bonacci while he was in prison talking about this stuff. There were a couple media appearances, but this was all back around the time of the early 90s, 91, 92, when this stuff was first starting to break.
Yeah, I'm almost positive I came across something like that when we were covering when we did cover like the Franklin scandal. But I was just like, oh, this is a whole other rabbit hole to get into with this Paperboy. So.
Yeah, it is big, and really does kind of shed light on the dynamics of how the trafficking ring works. That some of these kids are lured in through the promise of going to a party or drugs or whatever, but sometimes these kids are just straight up ripped from their families and outright trafficked and taken elsewhere. And it's a very it's a very important dimension to understand about how the Franklin case worked. And as more and more started developing about Paul Bonacci's information, a couple things happened. The West Des Moines police basically refused to talk to Johnny, talk to Bonacci. They basically said, well, Nebraska already discredited Paul Bonacci, so we're not going to reinvent the wheel, which is very dubious for a number of reasons. First of all, that Paul Bonacci was never discredited in any court of law. There was a grand jury indictment against him for perjury, but this grand jury indictment was never followed up on. The charges were dropped. So even if you do believe this grand jury, and you shouldn't, because Nick Bryant's book effectively demolishes it and shows what bullshit it was, but even if you did, Paul Bonacci was still never convicted. So you don't have that same kind of black mark for perjury that you can even use as an excuse. But they basically said, we're not interested in talking to Paul Bonacci. Later on, they finally did talk to some family members of Paul Bonacci, and then supposedly Paul Bonacci's family members said, well, he was with us at home the entire time. But they were being asked about an event, 10 years, pretty much 10 years prior. I'm not sure that I could remember with specificity exactly what I was doing on a particular day 10 years prior. I think that using that as a reason for discrediting Paul Bonacci is not at all compelling. It really seems as if the police department was finally getting enough pressure to do something, so they basically just did the bare minimum until they could find another excuse to dismiss Paul Bonacci and then go back to the same line that they always held to. And you would think that with such a cold case, that the police department had not come any closer to solving Johnny's abduction. There is really no excuse for not talking to him. That's not like the case is getting any warmer. Why wouldn't you check it out? Even a guy who has potential credibility issues could give you valid information. Why are you not even going to look at the information? But they still never did. So the only real investigation of sorts that would happen really come from Noreen's own PIs, people like Roy Stevens, and also shows like America's Most Wanted, which did a couple episodes on Johnny for quite some time. And as I said, America's Most Wanted was able to find that house in Colorado, but they also, very interestingly enough, found another guy by the name of Jimmy Gibson. Jimmy Gibson was about the same age as Johnny, and basically after America's Most Wanted, they had aired a couple of things, including this brand, this so-called Rocking X brand, which basically is the Rocking X is literally like the letter X, and then there's sort of the bottom half of a semicircle underneath it, so that the X is sitting right on top of the semicircle. This Rocking X was supposedly a brand that was literally used on many of these kids, including Johnny. This was something that Paul Bonacci talked about. He described he even drew the brand and it was shown on America's Most Wanted. And I guess, once again, by the way, this might be something that seemed far-fetched to people at the time, human trafficking rings that are branding people. But of course, with NXIVM coming out, right. So that, once again, this sort of thing, which you might think is totally outlandish, really is proven later on that it does actually happen. But after America's Most Wanted showed this brand, there was a person named Jimmy Gibson from Wisconsin who came forward and said, I was a victim of this pedophile ring too. I met Johnny Gosch, and I even have the brand to show on my leg that I can show people. So Noreen met with Jimmy Gibson. Jimmy told his story about meeting Johnny Gosch, and according to Noreen, Jimmy Gibson also related intimate details from Johnny's life, that were never made public as well. And he did indeed have that brand on his leg, the same Rocking X brand. And obviously, we can't totally rule out that there's just some weirdo out there who decides I'm gonna brand myself with a cattle iron or whatever. But I feel like that's a bit far-fetched compared to the notion that this person really was somehow affiliated with this network. And so Jimmy Gibson came forward. He basically corroborated a lot of what Bonacci said, corroborated Johnny's involvement in the trafficking ring, also corroborated the existence of this house in Colorado. Both Paul Bonacci and Jimmy Gibson went out to the house when America's Most Wanted did. It's just that Jimmy Gibson was a bit reluctant to show his face. Now, Jimmy Gibson would have a somewhat weird trajectory later on. Jimmy Gibson made claims of serving in Marine intelligence. He would later show up trying to discredit Paul Bonacci, discredit Noreen Gosch, say that it was all a lie, claim that he was some sort of undercover FBI informant sent to infiltrate America's Most Wanted. And most recently, this is actually very late-breaking news. It only happened in late July, and I only just found out about it this week. Jimmy Gibson was arrested in Wisconsin. He was arrested on child pornography and child abuse charges in Wisconsin recently. He's 53 years old or 54 years old now. So it does appear very likely that this is a cycle of abuse that sometimes happens.
Yes, I was just thinking that.
So Jimmy Gibson is at this point, confirmed pedophile, it would seem, but he also was a more or less confirmed member of this Franklin ring, and supplying yet another major piece of corroboration for Paul Bonacci's story. Now, the other major thing that was happening with the Gosch's private investigation at this time was looking into the man by the name of Charlie Kerr. Because recall, as I mentioned, there was Emilio, the suspect in Johnny's, the guy who was driving the blue car who approached Johnny. There was Tony, the guy who followed Johnny down the street and later was involved in forcing him into the blue car. There was Sam, who has been identified as Sam Soda. And these were the three people directly, immediately involved in the abduction. But then there was also Charlie, who owned the farmhouse near Sioux City, Iowa, where Johnny was taken to immediately after his abduction. And Paul Bonacci he described, this guy near Sioux City owns a farmhouse named Charlie. He also was able to draw a sketch of what Charlie looked like. And Roy Stevens took the sketch, began investigating with law enforcement contacts around Sioux City, and was actually able to dig up the name of a man named Charlie Kerr. And Charlie Kerr was indeed a farmhouse owner. He owned a farmhouse near Sioux City, Iowa. He also, as I was able to confirm through public records a couple years ago, Charlie Kerr does have a record of pedophilia himself. Charlie Kerr was accused by his 5-year-old daughter of molesting her, and in fact, it was so bad that he was only able to see her during supervised visits. And even on those visits, he still molested her, according to the police reports that I got. So this guy is an absolute total fucking sicko. And but this is the guy who Paul Bonaci's information on Charlie led to a very real person, Charlie Kerr, who was a farmhouse owner in the area and was a pedophile. So once again, you have this amazing extent of corroboration where Paul Bonacci is able to come up with so much information that either matches what the Gosches already know, or he's able to supply information that then leads them to other discoveries that, if he was just making this stuff up, you wouldn't expect it to produce more evidence. You wouldn't expect him to talk about a Colorado house where the kids were held captive and the house actually does exist and has a underground cavity with children's initials. You wouldn't expect him to talk about this farmhouse, this child trafficking safe house owner, Charlie, and then it turns out there's a guy fitting the description who is a pedophile. It's just that there's way too much that Paul Bonacci knows that you really can't spin any other way than Paul Bonacci being for real, actually being part of the abduction of Johnny Gosch exactly like he claims.
Yeah, that's something I was gonna. I wanted to add too, and it was what I was kind of getting at before and forgot to mention. When Paul, even Alicia and Troy, but back then at that time when they're giving their testimonies, it's not like they didn't have Google Maps. It's not like you can go ahead and just pick up an address and look at it on your phone from the sky view or the street view. I'm sorry. And know what it looks like and make it up. You know what I'm saying? These people were describing stuff that's you have to kind of be there. You couldn't go online and fucking look at it. You know what I'm saying? It's a place you had to be yourself.
That is an excellent point. Certainly, and I do think it's likely a lot of people, even if they don't realize they're doing it, kind of apply that modern day understanding. If I wanted to insert myself into this case, I could just Google details, read about it on Wikipedia, and just look up some stuff on Street View and describe it and then just tell that story. But you're right, you don't have anywhere near that ability to instantly research a case back then. It's information flow is a lot more difficult than it is now, and so Paul Bonacci's ability to describe this stuff was honestly far especially impressive in the context of the time, coming out in the early 90s, than it even is now. And I think a lot of people lose that realization that there is no reasonable scenario, to my mind, where you can say how Bonacci knows all this information without acknowledging that he is a credible witness. It's often said, all these conspiracy theorists will just make up evidence that to fit their worldview, but there comes a point when the conspiracy is honestly more compelling than the explanation that it was all made up. That if you're going to go with that whole notion of you should apply Occam's razor and go with the simplest explanation, but Occam's razor says it has to be the simplest explanation that fits all the evidence, and so you have to acknowledge all the evidence that points to Paul Bonacci being truthful. And when you do, the simplest explanation really is just that Paul Bonacci was correct in what he said about the Johnny Gosch abduction.
Yeah, there was even a lot of stuff when I was covering the Franklin cover-up, when I was listening to all their testimonies and stuff. There was a lot of stuff I did start to kind of look into and started to realize that's how I even came across Johnny Gosch's stuff, is trying to corroborate to see if any of his stuff was known to somehow be double checked. And that's when I started coming across I started listening and actually watching his interviews, and I realized I was there's a lot of detail here, and I'm thinking put it this way, I mentioned before, the technology we had back then, a lot of the interviews that I watched looked like they were recorded from a VHS tape. That's what we were dealing with back then.
Right.
VHS tapes.
Yeah, we are talking about late 80s, early 90s.
I'm this kid, he couldn't have Googled this shit. I was like, so unless like he's scripted and like fucking really got it down great, I was like, this kid I think is telling the truth, because some of it to me, it's like you had to be there to really say all that stuff. So that made me think that a lot of the stuff with the Johnny Gosch actually is quite credible. I know we spoke beforehand. I often wonder if the whole idea that Johnny Gosch ended up being that dude in the White House is a story to add on there to make it seem so silly that now you discredit anything that goes along with Johnny Gosch.
Yeah, I do think there was likely an element of that. Yeah, the whole Jeff Gannon thing where people were like, oh, Jeff Gannon, JG, and male prostitute. Oh, what if that's Johnny Gosch? And it became such a big, media circus in the alt media world, the parapolitical conspiracy community, where a lot of people were very heavily believing in it, and I still find people to this day in the conspiracy world who do believe it. But to clear the air about that, Johnny's mother is absolutely adamant that Jeff Gannon is not Johnny Gosch. Simply, the physical descriptions do not line up. Johnny Gosch would absolutely have been taller than Jeff Gannon was. There's pretty much no doubt about that. So there is really no evidence pointing to them, and you can actually document Jeff Gannon's history as well and find that he was a real person in various yearbooks around the time that Johnny Gosch was kidnapped. So there is no validity to that. There is something suspicious about Jeff Gannon for sure, but it was having these people like Ted Gunderson, who tried to attach the story of Johnny Gosch to Jeff Gannon and saying, oh, I'm 100% sure that they're the same people. Ted Gunderson being former FBI, former COINTELPRO, who later becomes the supposed champion for justice in these cases, is very, very disconcerting to me. And I think you're right that there's a lot of effort to insert elements like this to just make the story look more and more fantastical, so that people are inclined to dismiss everything.
Yeah. If you don't mind, I guess we'll wrap it up there as well. I think you pretty much covered that. That was amazing.
Sure.
Yeah, that was.
Thank you.
Yeah, that went a lot different than I even expected. Like that was like I was like, holy fuck, some detailed shit.
Yeah, I mean, it has gone on a while. Sadly, there are a lot of other potential connections to, the John Wayne Gacy stuff.
Oh yeah, I know. I originally had Gacy's name in the name of the title, and I've already edited it out because I was like, we didn't even get to Gacy. I just put Paul Bonacci's name in there instead.
Yeah, I mean, suffice to say, this is Franklin is a very large network, and a lot of pedophile cases from the 70s do appear to play a role in some of, connecting to some of what Paul Bonacci has talked about. There are signs that, Paul Bonacci has talked about other, Paul Bonacci's information does potentially connect in some other kidnappings, like the kidnapping of Michaela Garrett in California in 1988, which there's currently a guy who's accused of that, but I have some serious doubts about whether they're really involved or whether they're being set up to, once again, detract from the whole pedophile ring aspect, because way back in the early 90s, there was some customs agents found a child trafficking suspect, a NAMBLA member by the name of Richard Hellwig, who was apparently trafficking kids down in Mexico, and this girl, Michaela Garrett, was seen down in Mexico, according to some victims of Hellwig. And that in of itself is Michaela Garrett's abduction is another abduction where this mysterious Tony character shows up as basically matching the description of Michaela Garrett's kidnapper. And this mysterious Tony character is someone who I've come to suspect for a while may have been part of the John Wayne Gacy and John Norman pedophile network inner circle. But that may be a topic for another time.
I was actually
Franklin Network.
Sorry, I was actually going to ask you, if you don't mind, besides the topic that we spoke about prior, which I don't want to mention yet until we have you on for it, I would love to have you on for the Delta 9 project and the Gacy and the Norman and the Paskey connection. So
Yeah, of course.
Because that I think is so. I mean, that story in itself is just like I don't know. I mean, they're printing shit out of the prison. I was just like, what the fuck?
Right. The level of insane.
Come on.
I know. I mean, John Norman.
That's zero fucks
be...
too. Zero fucks given. I mean, they're sick fucks too, but I mean, zero fucks. They just didn't give a shit.
No, I mean you have to
Holy
find
shit.
it funny in a morbid
Yeah.
way. That John Norman, he's able to skate on these charges so many times. He is probably one of the most prolific pedophiles or child trafficking guys ever. He's been arrested like a dozen times, and every time he gets busted, he serves a short sentence and then starts up his next iteration of his pedophile magazine or his Delta Project type thing or whatever.
So it's
He's
writing
pretty
new
much
index cards.
yeah, he's like it's like a fucking cockroach of a pedophile that you can't get rid of him. He just keeps on going again and again, and the charges never seem to stick for whatever reason or another.
Because of the people he's supplying, I would assume.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so
that really is.
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I mean that absolutely is it. And
that's what
Paul
I think,
Bonacci, for what it's worth, at one point did make a statement where he talked about a pedophile ring in Chicago that seems uncannily similar to the one that Norman was operating. But again, that may be a story for a future episode. I think it will be good ground to cover.
For sure, yeah. George, if you can, let everybody know where they can find your stuff again.
Yeah, you can find me at cavdef.org. That's CAVDEF.org. If you go to cavdef.org, I would recommend going. Once you get there, there's a homepage. Click on the tab at the top that says Wiki, and that pretty much takes you to the data dump of sorts that I run with all sorts of information on these pedophile ring cases, summaries of the Johnny Gosch abduction, and links to all sorts of public records and other newspaper articles that I've collected over the years, and all sorts of information on these cases, and also various other cases I look at. I look at political assassinations and mind control, serial killer stuff, election manipulation. There is a lot of stuff on CAVDEF, and I find a lot of it interconnects in ways that you might not have expected.
Yeah, I was looking at your site before, and I was like, yo, there's a lot of fucking shit on here.
Yeah, it's been I know. It's a 6-year project of mine. It's been out for a while.
Holy fuck. I was like, yo, this guy's got credit even trying to just make this on the internet.
Well, thank you. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah, no, thank you for coming on. I honestly, I was already getting messages from people like, oh my God, you got George on. So I told you, I had people that were asking me to have you on. So thank you for coming on, for real. That was awesome. Everybody go check out his stuff. His links are in the bottom. And I'm definitely going to have you, well, we still have another topic to cover, and I'm definitely going to have you come on for that other stuff we just mentioned now. I think that'll be great.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, you definitely brought the heat with this, man. You blew, you totally, I thought it was going to be a good show, but like, holy shit. Like honestly, this is an episode I'd have to listen again myself. Like there was a lot of fucking info in there, and it's just like, what the fuck? Like all this stuff connects, and it's definitely, I think, one of the biggest cover-ups, for sure.
Yeah, it's a mind-boggling case.
Yeah, it's an old one, but I think it deserves more attention.
Without a doubt. Yeah, thank you for having me on. It's been great.
Sure. Yeah, so that is the end of another NY Patriot episode. Check out in the bottom, we got his links, and we got my links. And yeah, until the next one, everybody be well. Later.